I think we have to also look at, of all the things I've talked about, sanctions probably have the best chance of having some kind of impact on Putin's thinking. So it's about changing that equation in a way that hopefully minimizes harm to the people of Russia.
Then, as we discuss human rights, and particularly at the moment, the human rights, obviously, of people in Ukraine, the United Nations says it's going to look into, it's setting up a commission to look into human rights issues in Ukraine. I mean, even to the untrained eye, it would seem that human rights are being violated in Ukraine. Would that be your assessment as well?
Absolutely. I mean, we have heard reports, but we can also see on our screens that civilians are being deliberately targeted. We've had reports of the shelling of hospitals, of schools, orphanages. I mean, clearly horrific things are going on. I think the reason to set up this commission of inquiry is really when it comes to accountability. We need the burden of proof. We need to know exactly what's happened so that we can tell victims what's happened, so that we can tell the world what's happened, and hopefully that we can see the perpetrators brought to justice.
You mentioned the burden of proof there. Is this a conflict where actually the burden of proof is in some ways going to be reasonably straightforward? We are getting almost real-time video of what is happening in Ukraine. So in terms of actually proving what's going on, presumably that's not going to be all that difficult.
That's true, but we have to make sure that reports are verified, that they are specific. We have to make sure that video evidence is checked. There's a huge disinformation campaign. I think it's really important to make sure that there is a sort of international stamp that says, yes, this actually happened, this footage is true. And I think also when it comes to accountability, it's often easier to prosecute or charge people who are fairly low down the pecking order, who are actually the ones carrying out crimes. But the question is, can you link that back to those higher up the chain? And there, this work is really, really important. And one example is the humanitarian corridors. Now, these are, sort of pauses in fighting that are set up for a specific area for a specific time to enable aid to come through or people to leave. Usually the targeting of civilians, if it's deliberate, that is a war crime. And if civilians are targeted when there's an agreed pause in fighting, that, for example, would be an indication of a war crime.
I think it's important as well to understand how this works, because while we see the evidence, and you mentioned the humanitarian corridors there, which are important at this moment in time, and the bombing of civilians, while we are seeing these things unfold, in terms of actually prosecuting these as war crimes, that's not a particularly instant process, is it? In an ideal world, presumably we'd all want to see Vladimir Putin marched out of the Kremlin in handcuffs and thrown in jail for this sort of thing. But actually that's not necessarily how this is going to work.
No, and it's a perennial question. I mean, do you have all these mechanisms? We've seen the Human Rights Council, we've seen the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. There's a lot going on the accountability front. And the perennial question is, does that have any impact on the fighting? And quite frankly, I mean, the answer is no. I think Putin's gone beyond the point where he's going to care about this. It seems to be an all or nothing situation. But it is important to people now and at some point. I mean, I come from a country where atrocities have been committed in Sri Lanka, and I can tell you that knowing what's happened to your loved ones, that matters enormously. The world knowing what's happened to your loved ones, rather than being sort of fooled by propaganda, that really matters too. So justice is important, truth is important, and all these steps are part of a bigger puzzle of the types of responses we need to see.
So in terms then of a kind of short, medium, long-term view, I suppose, long-term there may be prosecutions for war crimes, and that is something that we may well get to in the months ahead. In terms of trying to establish and protect human rights in a war zone as a war is unfolding, how on earth does that work? How can that work? We are seeing the shelling of civilian buildings, of people trying to escape. Whose responsibility is it? Who can enforce human rights in that context?
Well, I mean, that's the tricky part of international law. I mean, and it's I think we've seen it done badly. There's plenty of examples of that. But ultimately, it's incumbent on governments to respect the Geneva Conventions, to respect human rights agreements. But the international community does have a responsibility to take whatever steps it can to ensure that human rights are protected. And I think we've seen quite a a sort of well-rounded international response in terms of the justice mechanisms, sanctions. The problem is that they will not have an immediate impact on the ground. However, I think over time, even in the coming days, we could see an impact in a couple of ways. One is those people who are ordinary Russians who have, for whatever reason, found themselves fighting a war that they may not well understand or agree with, knowing that they could be prosecuted. I think that may potentially have some effect on what they do. The second thing is the conduct of the government of Ukraine. I mean, right now we've seen Ukraine say all the right things and to all reports do all the right things, but war is very messy. And I think the fact that so much attention is on war crimes and human rights violations, again, this will really help all sides keep, hopefully, their conduct as good as possible in this kind of situation.
That's the conduct in war. I wonder if there's any concern from you about how refugees are being treated as they try to escape Ukraine and whether their human rights are being infringed upon at this point. Already we've heard reports in the last few days of discrimination on the borders and people being sent back because they are Black, for example. They're being sent to the back of the queue to get out of Ukraine. I wonder if these things start straying into human rights abuses as well.
Any sort of discrimination clearly does, but particularly for people who are fleeing a war zone. It's been absolutely appalling to see how different, well, firstly, the treatment of all people, but secondly, the treatment of particular groups. I think a lot of Asian and African students have been treated very, very badly, not just not being allowed to leave, but also then when they're coming into other countries, we are seeing different levels of protection. So Ukrainians are given one standard of protection, third country citizens, or citizens of other countries, they're being allowed fewer days or less favorable terms to stay. That really has to end. We've also seen a lot of disturbing talk about the right kinds of refugees. I mean, it's great to see countries embrace Ukrainians, but to see them do that on the basis that they're also European, they're also white, they're also Christian. I mean, there's only one kind of, I think, right refugee, and that is a safe refugee. And that has to be our priority right now. And the discrimination also needs to be looked at in terms of Russians who are fleeing Ukraine, but also are fleeing their own country. It's not like they're having a good time over there. And we need to kind of put into context in our refugee response that people from Russia, from Belarus, may also be wanting to leave, and they also deserve safe haven.
Just as a final thought then, because the other kind of angle to all of this is sanctions, and the sanctions that are being imposed clearly particularly on Russia at the moment. I do just wonder if there is a balancing act to be done here in terms of imposing sanctions that are crippling to a war effort without actually sort of damaging, as it were, normal people who are, they could be the protesters, for example, who are very anti-war. Is there a risk that sanctions could ever step over a line in terms of abusing the human rights of innocent people in the country that the sanctions are aimed at?
There is always a risk. And I think we have to also look at, of all the things I've talked about, sanctions probably have the best chance of having some kind of impact on Putin's thinking. So it's about changing that equation in a way that hopefully minimizes harm to the people of Russia. One way to do that is focus on individual sanctions. So we've seen a lot in terms of freezing assets, I think travel bans, making it really hard for Putin and his cronies to do what they usually do, enjoy life, travel around, send their kids to posh schools. All these things are actions that we could be taking. And then on the broader sanctions piece, again, there's a lot that is happening. We have to be mindful, I think, maybe prioritizing companies that aren't exactly mission critical to people's lives. So things that are high fashion or, brands that will have an impact, add to the symbolism, add to the pressure, but aren't critical. But then I think the most important one, and this is where it gets very tricky, is energy. At the moment, we're still sending hundreds of millions every day to Russia for oil and gas. That's a sector that has the most chance of hurting Putin's war effort. That's the one that has to be really, really carefully balanced with support to people in Russia to make sure that these sanctions are only used when they have the chance of success and won't cripple the economy beyond that.